presentation this afternoon in our Cunard Insights Enrichment Program. This morning we were talking about the great Atlantic liners, of course. Well, we're talking something different here. The special relationships in politics between the UK and the US. And our keynote speaker this afternoon has served at all four levels of American government: local, state, national, and international. And over a period of 35 years of a wonderful career. He went to Washington in 1981 to be the executive assistant to then Vice President George H.W. Bush. President Ronald Reagan appointed him as an Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And the first President Bush appointed him a senior White House aide and a director of the Voice of America. And the second President Bush appointed him U.S. Ambassador to the state of Qatar. And he served there from 2004 to 2007. And he's talking about special relationships between Churchill, Roosevelt, Macmillan and Eisenhower, Thatcher and Reagan, Tony Blair with Clinton and George Bush, and of course, what's happening between David Cameron and Barack Obama. I hope you give him a great round of applause. I'm sure we're in for a real treat here. Chas Untermeyer, thank you.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you all very much. Thank you for coming. Before I launch into the discussion that's on the program for today, I did want to do a little bit more of an introduction and also a preview of some of the other things I'll be talking about on this crossing. I am a good example, I think, of something that is very peculiar to American politics and to people from Britain or elsewhere in Europe. They're often amazed, if not appalled, at how the American system manages to take people who have not had necessarily any experience in government, and through the power of political appointment, the wand is waved over them and they become something. Once I heard a lecture by a professor at Harvard who said that in Great Britain and also in Western Europe and Japan, there is a very advanced senior civil service. And young men and women take an exam, and if they're very good at the exam, they get selected for the civil service or the foreign service, and over a period of time can rise to very senior positions, all but the very, very top positions. This professor went on to say that in America, if you bet on the right presidential candidate, you are presumed to have passed the exam. And I can claim that, in that I come from Houston, Texas, where the two Presidents Bush, primarily Father Bush, come from. And through the acts of politics, I managed to get a chance to go to Washington and do the various things that Ray mentioned in his talk, including a chance to be U.S. Ambassador in Qatar. Later this week, I'll talk about the Middle East, the very exciting developments this year that's been called the Arab Spring, with another talk about how U.S. foreign policy is made. That's something else, not for the faint of heart or the weak of stomach, to hear about that process, because there are many, many players, much more than just the President, much more than just the U.S. Department of State. And then finally, I will be talking, an illustrated talk, about a place where I spent a total of 4.5 years in my life, namely in the White House itself, the West Wing of the White House, which is the working end of the very famous executive mansion. But the White House, of course, is also a residence for the presidential family. I'll talk a little bit about that, but I'll also give an idea of just what it's like to work in the White House. Today's subject, however, is on the special relationship between the U.S. and the UK. And there's no better place to start than with the address that President Obama gave just a few months ago on the 25th of May, speaking to Parliament. He began with a bit of levity. He said, and I'm quoting, "All relationships have their ups and downs. Admittedly, ours got off on the wrong foot with a small scrape about tea and taxes. And there may also have been some hurt feelings when the White House was set on fire during the War of 1812. But fortunately," President Obama said, "it's been smooth sailing ever since." Well, the President's humor may have been on, but his history was a bit off, because in truth, Anglo-American relations were anything but smooth from 1812 right through the entry of the United States into the Second World War. And as I will discuss in a moment, they were not always as close and warm during the war as nostalgia and goodwill have caused us to remember. Relations with Great Britain dominated American foreign policy for a century and a half, ever since they ceased to be a matter of domestic policy. They were the cause of the first great split in American politics in foreign affairs between the Federalist Party of George Washington and John Adams, who favored Great Britain, and the Republican Party of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who favored France during the Napoleonic Wars. Andrew Jackson, our sixth president, was throughout his life seethingly anti-British, having been slashed by a British officer with his sword during the Revolutionary War when Jackson, who was then a teenager, refused to polish the gentleman's boots. It is not an overstatement to say that the populist antipathy in America to all things foreign that continues to this day was a result of that blow to Jackson's forehead. Jackson was a fearsome American nationalist whose spiritual successors in our time include George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, and Sarah Palin. The so-called Tea Party movement in the United States is focused on purely domestic fiscal issues, but to the extent it pays attention to foreign affairs, it is suspicious of foreigners and foreign entanglements. In the first half of the 19th century, Britain and the young United States clashed diplomatically many times over such things as America's annexation of Florida and Texas and over the borders of Maine. Before the Oregon boundary was settled peaceably, many Americans demanded all of British Columbia up to the parallel of 54 degrees and 40 minutes north latitude, giving rise to the cry, 54-40 or fight. Partly this bad feeling was due to the two wars our countries had fought within living memory, and partly it was due to the American resentment as a growing continental power against the world's top dog. This was true even though that top dog's Navy protected the United States and in effect enforced its Monroe Doctrine against other European powers. During the American Civil War, Britain unofficially favored the South for entirely commercial reasons. As Lord Palmerston said with typical blunt practicality, "We don't like slavery, but we want cotton," by which he meant Southern cotton for the mills of Lancashire. The two nations did come close to war in 1861 over an incident fraught with classic 19th century hypersensitivity to national honor. A ship of the U.S. Navy stopped a British merchant vessel, the Trent, and removed two Confederate officials on board. Feelings grew hot in both London and Washington, but war was averted due to the intervention of Prince Albert on the eve of his premature death, and by Abraham Lincoln, who sighed, "One war is enough at a time." After the North's victory in the Civil War, tensions once again between the United States and Great Britain continued to fester over such things as the boundary of Canada and Alaska, and those of Venezuela and British Guiana. After the last dispute, Lord Salisbury, who was the British Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary at the end of the 19th century, abandoned his view that Britain has no friends, only interests, and he decided to acquire a couple of well-placed friends, namely the United States and Japan. The growing friendship between the United States and Britain was greatly aided by the long personal relationship between the new globally minded American president, Theodore Roosevelt, and a British diplomat, Cecil Spring Rice. And Salisbury saw in Japan a sort of Asian England, an island nation complete with a monarchy, colonial interests, and an aristocracy with titles like Viscount. This was a good move on its own account, but it also freed Britain to pay attention to a genuine foe, namely Wilhelmine Germany. When World War I broke out, the British and French dearly hoped for American entry into the war on their side. But President Woodrow Wilson reflected his country's sentiment that the war was none of America's business, even after its citizens and eventually its ships were the victims of German U-boats. Wilson's reluctance was steeped in the political realities of the United States at the time. Though the primary ethnic stock in America was British, it was largely of the Andrew Jackson or so-called Scotch-Irish variety. Irish Catholics, who came to America by the millions in the 19th century, were of course totally hostile to Britain. And outnumbering the Irish were those of German origin, proud of the old country's technological, cultural, and industrial challenge to the UK. In 1916, Woodrow Wilson was able to win re-election to the White House by a very narrow margin on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." Britain did have friends in the United States during those years, drawn mostly from the social and economic elite of the East Coast, men like Theodore Roosevelt, J.P. Morgan, and Senator Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts. It also had a key advocate in Wilson's closest advisor, Colonel Edward Mandell House, who was a Texan and a strong Anglophile. But when the United States finally entered the war, it pointedly did so only as an associated power, not an ally of the British and French. This suspicion of Britain and other European lands as tricky and conniving continued past the war and was a main reason that Woodrow Wilson failed to get the U.S. Senate to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. One of his opponents in that fight, Senator Hiram Johnson of California, declared in an angry address, "It took George Washington 7 years to win our independence from George III, and now they're trying to give it back to George V." American isolationism in those years, its insistence that nations like Britain pay back their war debts, a demand for a reduction in the capital ships of the Royal Navy, and the general inward attention of the United States during the Great Depression all combined to separate the two nations by more than an ocean during the 1920s and 30s. H.G. Wells wrote that every time Europe looks across the Atlantic to see the American eagle, it observes only the rear end of an ostrich. The old U.S. domestic political prejudices continued as well. When it was reported, incorrectly, that King George might visit the United States, the mayor of heavily Irish Chicago warned that he would personally punch him in the snoot. Indeed, it could be said that during this period, the only significant instance of Anglo-American friendship was that between King Edward VIII and Mrs. Wallace Warfield Simpson of Baltimore. Then came World War II and the birth of what we are celebrating as the special relationship. But as the American historian Lynn Olson has chronicled very well, even starkly, in her superb new book called Citizens of London, this relationship was not always the smooth sailing recently hailed before Parliament by President Obama. Such actions during 1940, 1941 as Lend-Lease, or the trading of 50 World War I-era destroyers for British bases in the Western Hemisphere, praised in most histories as examples of Franklin Roosevelt's firm desire to aid Britain before his countrymen were ready to fight Hitler. These acts were at the time considered by the British leadership as too little, too late, and speaking of the destroyers, too old. After the U.S. did enter the war, senior military leaders on both sides held strongly negative views of the other. In particular, Generals Brooke and Montgomery against Americans, and Generals Patton, Bradley, and Mark Clark against the British. The one general who strove most valiantly to overcome these divisions was Dwight Eisenhower. This tension grew as American forces and equipment surged ahead of British men and materiel in the period prior to D-Day, and as many ancient English villages and farms were destroyed to build U.S. bases. Though many ordinary American soldiers received warm, even fond hospitality from the British people while stationed in the UK prior to D-Day, there was often heard the complaint that American GIs were overpaid, oversexed, and overhere. Many GIs in Britain, forgetting the immense losses and sacrifices of the British people, had their own complaints about the food and the weak beer. Olson tells of a young Englishwoman in uniform who approached 2 American sentries on duty in London and asked how they liked it in Britain. One answered politely that he did, but the other growled that they should cut all these barrage balloons loose and let this damn place sink. The young woman wrinkled her nose in reaction, said nothing, and walked away. She was Princess Elizabeth, who, if she thought ill, or at least thought ill of one particular American on that occasion, has never displayed a trace of it since. In her toast to President Obama at Buckingham Palace in May, Her Majesty called the United States our most important ally, which twice came to the rescue of the free and democratic world when it was facing military disaster. Though Roosevelt and Churchill had a famously warm and close relationship at the beginning of American involvement in the war, this began to cool starting at the Tehran Conference in 1943, as FDR played up to Joseph Stalin, sometimes using Churchill as the butt of jabs to win a smile from the Soviet dictator. Roosevelt was antithetical to Britain's maintaining an empire, especially in India, which was one of Churchill's cardinal beliefs. The PM's anger was increased by the fact that Roosevelt seemed to have no problem at all with the Soviet Union's acquiring a post-war empire in Eastern Europe. Churchill also grew weary of constantly playing the suitor to a man, FDR, who dearly loved to be wooed. The Prime Minister disliked the fact that whereas he, a man 8 years older than the President, had made several wartime crossings of the Atlantic, FDR never once came to Britain as President, despite repeated invitations. This fueled Churchill's decision not to make one more trip to Washington at the time of Roosevelt's funeral in April 1945. And then immediately after Japan surrendered and World War II was over, the new president, Harry Truman, abruptly canceled Lend-Lease food aid to Britain, prolonging for years the rationing of meat, sugar, and other foodstuffs. What was going on, of course, was a major historic shift in Western power away from Great Britain and toward the United States. A virtually destitute Britain had to turn its attentions to domestic needs, then being dramatically reshaped by a new Labour government, and to the disintegration of its colonial empire. At the same time, America now had an entire globe to pay attention to. As Lord Douglas Hurd, British Foreign Secretary from 1989 to 1995, wrote in his memoirs, for a short period, after the defeat of Japan, but before Stalin's Russia was seen as a major threat, Britain was not particularly important to the United States. In this period, if Britain could not provide imperial heft to the transatlantic relationship, it hoped to provide wisdom and guidance. A jingle that went round the British delegation to the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference on the economic future of the post-war world chirped, "In Washington, Lord Halifax once whispered to Lord Keynes, 'It's true they have the money bags, but we have all the brains.'" A much-quoted version of the same attitude was the remark made by Harold Macmillan, whose mother, like Churchill's, was an American, to Richard Crossman when both were serving in North Africa during World War II. Though of different political parties, Macmillan and Crossman shared a classical public school and Oxford education. And it was with that common base that Macmillan said, "We, my dear Crossman, are Greeks in this American empire. You will find the Americans much as the Greeks found the Romans, great, big, vulgar, bustling people, more vigorous than we are, and also more idle, with more unspoiled virtues, but also more corrupt. We must run Allied forces headquarters as the Greek slaves ran the operations of the Emperor Claudius." Well, though death and political defeat ended the wartime relationship between Roosevelt and Churchill, the American-British relationship got a major recharge when its leading proponent in uniform, Dwight Eisenhower, became President of the United States in 1953. Churchill was then back briefly as Prime Minister, and his two successors, Anthony Eden and Harold Macmillan, were also men whom Ike had gotten to know well during the war. This greatly helped keep things going during the greatest challenge to the relationship, namely the Suez Crisis of 1956. In brief, the United States opposed the Anglo-French-Israeli invasion of Egypt that fall, and the United States took the extraordinary step of threatening to withdraw its support of the pound sterling if Britain did not agree to a ceasefire. This was seen as a shocking betrayal of an old friendship by many Britons. As Lord Hurd later wrote, "No sentimental recollection of our lonely stand against Hitler and no rhetoric about a special relationship influenced the chilly American calculation of U.S. interests." Fortunately, the Eisenhower-Macmillan tie helped patch together the alliance after Suez. And again, fortunately for Britain, Macmillan enjoyed a tie with Ike's young successor in the White House, John F. Kennedy. It was familial and a bit of a stretch, but it helped. Macmillan was married to Lady Dorothy Cavendish, whose nephew, the Marquis of Hartington, had married Kennedy's sister. In his 1994 book, Diplomacy, Henry Kissinger wrote, "Having shrewdly calculated that they could no longer hope to shape American policy by the traditional methods of balancing benefits and risks, British leaders chose, especially after Suez, to tread the road to greater influence. British leaders of both parties managed to make themselves so indispensable to the American decision-making process that presidents and their entourages came to regard consultations with London not as a special favor toward a weaker ally, but as a vital component of their own governance. It was under Macmillan," Kissinger went on to say, "that Great Britain completed the transition from power to influence. He decided to embed British policy in American policy and to expand the range of British options by skillfully handling relations with Washington. Macmillan never contested a philosophical or conceptual point and rarely laid down an open challenge to key American policies. He readily conceded the center stage to Washington while seeking to shape the drama from behind the curtains." It is this sort of Greeks to Roman role that continues to characterize the Anglo-American relationship today, albeit with some of those ups and downs to which President Obama referred in Westminster Hall. The greatest post-war high was the presidential administration of Ronald Reagan, which was overlapped by the government of his ideological soulmate, Margaret Thatcher. Now, I'm not going to talk much about that because we're fortunate to have on board Lord Geoffrey Howe, who will speak in greater detail on this famous pairing, which he observed at closer range. Because I'd also like to mention another character who was very vital to the relationship during those Reagan years, and that was Britain's great staunch friend, Caspar Weinberger, who was Reagan's Secretary of Defense. When Argentina invaded the Falklands in 1982, the U.S. State Department under Alexander Haig took a neutral stance in favor of negotiations between the parties, mindful of ancient Latin American suspicion of the Yankee Colossus. It was Weinberger who won the bureaucratic battle inside Washington to give Britain what he later described as everything short of actual participation in the military action itself. When Weinberger died in 2006, Lady Thatcher came to his funeral in silent tribute, just as she had for President Reagan 2 years earlier. The good feeling between the U.S. and Britain was continued and strengthened under Reagan's and Thatcher's immediate heirs, George H.W. Bush and John Major, who were in power during another conflict, the first Gulf War. Just after Major became prime minister, he conferred with Bush at Camp David about Saddam Hussein's occupation of Kuwait. Wrote Bush later, "John never flinched. He declared on the spot that the British would be with us all the way. I shall never forget that. He became the first foreign leader to know our war plans and the first outside our own American official circle, fittingly so, given his dependability and unwavering support, and Margaret Thatcher's before him." Major returned the sentiment in his memoirs, writing of that meeting in the Maryland mountains, "There was no hesitation, no unease, no holding back, no probing to find the other's position." If the Thatcher-Reagan and Major-Bush relationships were a transatlantic up during those years, they were followed by a down when Bill Clinton became president. There was early tension between the Clinton and Major staffs, if not between the two men themselves, when it was revealed that Conservative Party operatives had briefed counterparts in the Republican Party after the 1992 Tory victory about how a party long in power could win yet another election. Later, Clinton invited Gerry Adams of Sinn Féin to the White House, which horrified many in the UK. Baroness Thatcher said, "It was like our inviting the Oklahoma City bomber to number 10. And on the 50th anniversary of V-Day in 1995, Clinton pointedly went to Russia and even to Germany, but not to Britain for its commemoration. The irony of this low point in recent Anglo-American relations was that Bill Clinton was so far the only Rhodes Scholar to become President of the United States. Cecil Rhodes endowed his famous scholarship at Oxford in the hope that, quote, "a good understanding between England and the United States of America will secure the peace of the world." At least during the opening years of the Clinton presidency, Mr. Rhodes did not get his money's worth. The relationship, both personal and bilateral, bounced back when Tony Blair succeeded John Major as prime minister. This was not surprising, given the fact that Blair is, after all, a better-behaved British edition of Bill Clinton, political to the last corpuscle. What is surprising is that Blair also developed a close tie with a wholly different sort of president, namely George W. Bush. Both men are political practitioners of the highest order in their respective countries, but it was unpredictable that they would become close friends and forge a strong bond. The reason, of course, was the Iraq War and Blair's unhesitating support of it, so much so that his critics in the UK accused him of being Bush's poodle. This was grossly unfair to Blair, to Bush, and to poodles. Chris Patten, former MP, European Commissioner for External Relations, and the last British governor of Hong Kong, said in his excellent book, Cousins and Strangers, that in Iraq in 2003, Britain went to war because America chose to go to war. Where substance is important to America, the most that Britain can usually do is to effect process. So, in return for the prospect of influence, Britain provides a sign to the world that America is not unilateralist. Britain is a multilateral pin to put in America's lapel. Yet, Patten continued, supporting the Bush invasion of Iraq is probably the worst service that we have paid America, and may even make it more difficult politically for us in Britain to line up beside our old ally when there are bigger and better causes to pursue together in the future. Patten wrote in 2006, and 5 years later, Britons and Americans are still side by side in Afghanistan, as well as in Libya, and in the waters off the coast of Africa, infested by a new style of pirate. This shows the very abiding and very practical aspect of ties that both countries enjoy. As John Major put matters very well in his memoirs, although the term special relationship is often misused, there is a unique rapport between Britain and the United States. British politicians and the military do not have the same reserve in dealing with their American counterparts that they show elsewhere, and confidences are shared as a matter of course. It is a product of history and the long relationship of trust between like-minded democracies with a common language and similar, but not always identical, interests in the world. I close with the reaffirmation of that relationship made by the current leaders of both countries, Barack Obama and David Cameron, in a rare joint editorial in the Times of London on the eve of the President's arrival in Britain this spring. In it, the two men said that the key to the Anglo-American relationship was that it is founded on a deep emotional connection by sentiment and ties of people and culture. But the reason it thrives, the reason why this is such a natural partnership, is because it advances our common interests and shared values. It is a perfect alignment of what we both need and what we both believe. And the reason it remains strong is because it delivers time and again. Ours is not just a special relationship, it is an essential relationship for us and for the world. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.